Well, welcome everyone to this week's Chalk Talk. I am really excited to be hosting a conversation with my friend and two-time Paralympic athlete, Eli Wolf. Eli directs the Power of Sport Lab, which is a platform to fuel and magnify creativity, diversity, connection, and leadership through sport. Eli is also an instructor with the sport management program at the University of Connecticut and is co-founder and advisor to the Sport and Society Initiative at Brown University. He's also, like, the list goes on. I'm not going to say everything, but his background is amazing. Eli is the co-founder of Disability in Sport International, Athletes for Human Rights, and the Olympism Project, all research, education, and advocacy initiatives. And I just learned today that Eli is going to be inducted into the National Disability Mentoring Coalition Hall of Fame on March 30th. So congrats and welcome, Eli.
It's great to be here. No, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, such a pleasure. All right, so let's jump right in here. So Eli, I understand that when you were growing up, your parents were very focused on academics, sports, and service, and that your grandfather was a law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Warren for Brown versus Board of Education too. Amazing. So I'd love to hear about how your family's values and experiences influenced you as an athlete, a student, and a person.
Yeah, no, it was very inspiring, growing up and, with my family, particularly my grandfather, knowing that story, even at an early age, and also his journey, not only at the Supreme Court and the Brown versus Board, but then he then went out to Los Angeles and he was involved with entertainment law early on. And so being around that, but also with the values, with kind of the awareness around social justice and service and community, that was always really a theme. And it came through from my parents as well, both on my dad and then my mom. My mom's a child psychologist. And so we definitely got a lot of, analysis and a lot of information and a lot of good thoughts from my mom. But yeah, no, it was definitely very instrumental for me. And then I had a stroke when I was 2 years old. So that when at a young age I had a stroke, and so being able to kind of get back and regroup and then get into school and get into sports and get into all sorts of activities, I really credit my parents for like just getting me back into it all and really encouraging me to kind of go for it. So yeah, that was a little bit of it. But yeah, my grandfather in particular, it's just kind of interesting now, kind of given the work that I'm doing now around social justice and human rights, that, whether it was just, osmosis or kind of just looking back on it, it's just very interesting. And also kind of having worked on the Supreme Court case, the Casey Martin case too. So all these connections, it's really kind of interesting and it's kind of wild in some ways.
We're gonna have to have a later conversation about the Casey Martin case for sure. So Eli, I'm curious, like what was the first sport that you played, and how did you start playing soccer? And then final question, when did you first start thinking that you might compete in the Paralympic Games?
So early on, I really started to get involved with soccer, with racket sports, with volleyball, basketball. So I started doing a lot of sports, but then I kind of slowly got more focused on particularly around soccer. And so I was on some of the different teams that, growing up. And then in high school, so I came up to Boston. My family went out to Washington, D.C., then I came up to Boston for high school, a boarding school. But I hadn't really heard about the Paralympics, all through up until high school. But I was just playing with my community teams, with the school team. But then in high school, I started doing some community work at a local rehabilitation center in right outside of Boston. And there was a gentleman there who many know, Sebastian DiFrancesco, who's a table tennis Paralympian, who was very like a mentor at the rehab center. And he saw me both playing at high school and then also at the rehab center. doing community work. And he said, "Oh, have you ever heard about the Paralympics?" And so that was really the first time. So then we shot a video of me playing soccer, and we sent it in, and then kind of the rest is history. But yeah, I just always very active. I was able, even though I had a stroke on the left side, I'm still able to run, keep up. I played at Brown as well while I was there in college. Um, I wasn't a starter, but I was still a part of the team. And but having those experiences really helped me at the Paralympic level.
Sorry, unmute myself there. If I just want to say, if anyone has questions, please put those in the Q&A, and we'll take those as we go along. And please, we want your questions. All right, so Eli, many of us in the last month were watching the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Beijing and saw all sorts of amazing athletic performances on the luge track, skating rink, and of course other drama there on the ski slopes, on all of the sports venues. And as always, athletes were focused on winning. Everyone was counting medals, countries, and the commercial partners, as usual, are keeping tabs on viewership and fan engagement. So those are things that happen at many large sporting events, but the Olympic and Paralympic Games, as you and I know, and probably a lot of people on the call, are different in some really important ways. And I just want to start with the Olympic Charter, which sets forth a number of fundamental principles. So the first one states, Olympism is a philosophy of life, exalting and combining in a balanced whole the qualities of body, will, and mind. Blending sport with culture and education, Olympism seeks to create a way of life based on the joy of effort, the educational value of good example, social responsibility, and respect for universal fundamental ethical principles. So Eli, a lot of your work after sort of retiring from competitive sport has been focused on this concept of Olympism and promoting the use of sport to create positive social change. So what inspired you? We know a little bit about your family, but what else inspired you to get on this path?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a very instrumental, very inspiring when I started to get involved with the Paralympic side, and then also the Olympic side, just more in terms of becoming a part of some of the educational programs at the USOC at the time, now the USOPC, were providing. I think because of my, interests of learning more, and also to be involved beyond the field, that I started getting to become engaged. Many years ago there was a different programs. One was called the U.S. Olympic Academy, and then they would send leaders, and they still send leaders off to the International Olympic Academy. And so I got to take part in that. Actually, Nathaniel Mills was also the year that I went. But then each year, I actually got to go back as a coordinator and then a lecturer and some different roles. But I think because of those values, and because I think, my connection to values and the importance of values, it really struck a chord for me, and it really sort of inspired me to think, beyond the field and beyond just the competition itself, but to really look at the kind of the whole picture. And also in terms of kind of what it meant to me in terms of thinking about issues of diversity and inclusion, and issues of belonging, and issues of, connecting the dots between Olympians and Paralympians. I started having some sort of like these aha moments and recognitions, and in some ways it was interesting, even on the team, on the US team in Atlanta and in Athens. I was oftentimes the one on the team that was asking the questions, the global questions, or the questions about, why are things the way they are? What about this? But I think that Olympism sort of became a guide and a way to think about the world that sort of inspired me to have that framework. And then it also opened up some doors. It opened up my thinking and my involvement with the United Nations, with the Olympic Committee. I was able to get involved with the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then into the sport for development and peace world. So, but all these things are sort of connected to Olympism in many ways. But yeah, and also, I mean, just quick story on my, another part of the path is I also met through the Paralympic Games, and I met Sherry, my wife. And so, these values and these experiences, they really do bring people together. And for me, it really does hit home in a very strong way. But a lot of my teammates, a lot of my friends, a lot of, the Olympic and Paralympic community, the broader sport for development, it's sort of an interest. It's a really amazing kind of journey and connections to a lot of people that share these values, which I think has been very empowering.
So I just want to kind of circle back to your experience at the International Olympic Academy, because I've been there myself, and I don't know about you, but when I was competing in the Olympics, like you go to the games, you're very focused on your competition and what you've been training for many years. And while you meet people from different countries, there's not a whole lot of opportunity to like meaningfully interact. But the first time that I went to the International Olympic Academy, and for the folks on the call, the IOA is in Olympia, Greece. It's at the birthplace of the the ancient Olympic Games, and it is kind of this mecca for Olympians and people who hold the Olympic movement dear, I think. And it's really kind of a magical and transformational experience. And when I went there, it was the summer before my last Olympic Games, and I thought, oh, like I really sort of understand so much more about the movement. And before, I felt like I'd competed in the Olympics, and after that experience, I was like, okay, now I'm an Olympian. Now I really kind of understand. So I don't know if your experience there was similar.
Yeah, some of the different programs, the young participants program, and these different opportunities to be able to experience the Olympic Academy, and to learn about Pierre de Coubertin, and some of the different aspects of the history, and even just getting to meet some of the educators and those people that are doing research in this area and thinking about these questions. But yeah, it was really just more the people, and just that environment of being at the academy. Yeah, definitely very motivational, and helped kind of open a different perspective, and also a different lens of thinking about the whole system. But yeah, no, it's definitely been a great, and also just that whole network, the whole community of those that have been involved with the IOA. It is nice. I feel like we can go anywhere and have some friends, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a community, and really like a family. So let's see. So coming up on April 6th is the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, which is recognized by the UN. And I know that you worked with some of your colleagues on that for a number of years to sort of make this happen. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that idea was conceived, and what you were all hoping to achieve with this sort of recognition of a day of sport for development and peace.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that, and yeah, really, it's kind of the recognition of it is this one day on the year. It's been adopted by the General Assembly. It has a strong presence, and it's been the first year that it was celebrated was 2014. In 2013, it was approved by the General Assembly, and then 2014, it's been happening each year as an international day, just like the International Day, Women's Day, or the International Day of Peace, or some of these other days. I mean, the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, or the Power of Sport Day, it's not as globally recognized, but it's definitely gain some traction, some momentum. And it does kind of have, it's a moment, it's a way to recognize, what we've achieved, how much further we can go, what sport can do in a way to transform our communities, our societies. But really, when those of us, came together, again, back, it was many years ago, back in like 2007, 2005, 6, 7, we were we were starting to see in the early 2000s really the emergence of kind of the sector of sport for development and peace, and really seeing it grow and emerge. And when a number of us, international organizations, experts, stakeholders, we were just starting to have some conversations about, well, it wouldn't be the be all end all, but one contribution could be this sort of recognition of an international day that could perhaps locate the field and help to gain some momentum and some traction. And so we put some, pen to paper, and, we kind of sketched it out. I have some of the drafts of, kind of the concept. And then there were, on the governmental side at the United Nations, the group of friends and some of the other groups, there were already some kind of initial conversations, some considerations of it, and not sure, would this be a good thing? Wouldn't it be? And I think by kind of this external group kind of making a case for it and showing, what it could do, perhaps, I do think it helped to spark, further engagement around it. But it really was, there were some governments that came in, and also the International Olympic Committee came in to give it some support overall. But yeah, it was fun to sort of be a part of it. I remember we were in Geneva at one point, and we were sitting around a coffee table and talking it through. I mean, this is still several steps to go, but just some of the memories of kind of being able to work on that. And then now, each year it's kind of fun to see the role. I'm involved with Sport for Development Peace, every day of the year, but particularly on that day, it's really amazing to see kind of some of the activations and some of the initiatives. This year, there will be a focus around climate change, sport and climate change, although it'll also be even broader, as well. But yeah, each year there are sometimes different themes or different approaches or different focuses, but oftentimes it does center back to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the SDGs, to other platforms, other initiatives taking place throughout the United Nations during COVID, particularly around the WHO. So there's oftentimes it's intersectional, but recognizing that the power of sport, is not just what's happening on the playing fields, but it's about how sport is utilized as a vehicle for within our communities and within our world. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. So one from someone Sandra Kimakoti.
Hi, Sandra.
Who is in one of my classes now. So Sandra asks, Eli, could you share a bit more about what your work with the UN entails and what the intended impact is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the work, as I described, particularly around the International Day is one project, but also kind of in an ongoing way. There's a variety of reports, there's a variety of initiatives that take place by UN sport, by UN DESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, as well as other UN agencies across the board. But my role is really, I would say, sort of as a external, expert or a scholar, a researcher. I think because of my work in the disability space, oftentimes there will be questions around disability inclusion. But even in the last couple of years, there's been several kind of, meetings or expert meetings where they're working on reports or curriculums or working books or different things like that. And but it's nice to be a part of a cross range of issues, whether that's on integrity and whether that's on technology, whether that's on, disability inclusion, or, the variety of issues of sport for development. Um, so yeah, I would say, but that maybe gives a snapshot that it's definitely a more in an advisory capacity. Um, and then for the International Day, I have a little bit more of a role just because of my involvement from the outset, and having been kind of a part of that working group for the day.
Thank you. Oh, well, so I guess to follow on what you've been talking about already here. So this year, I know you said the April 6th is going to be focusing on climate change. The broader theme is securing a sustainable and peaceful future for all. The contribution of sport. So the UN says they're using this to create an opportunity to promote the use of sport as a tool to advance human rights and sustainable development. So I'd be interested, and I think our audience would be interested in hearing, what are some ways that you have seen sport used in such a way as a tool to advance human rights and sustainable development?
Yeah, no, it's definitely been amazing to see in the last, 15 years, 10, 15 years, just a lot of the innovative, projects and programs and organizations, and really people. It's really about people recognizing that how sport can be instrumental to impact communities and bring people together in really valuable ways, whether that's on the environment or issues like homelessness or HIV/AIDS, or gender equity or disability, race, ethnicity, religion, conflict resolution, peace building. In many ways, sports can be brought in and utilized in a lot of different ways, but it's really about the intentionality of it. So if you kind of just have sport and you're not really being intentional with how it can then be focused or constructed to have a certain outcome or impact, then it may not lead to that. You're kind of just letting it be. In some ways, sport is sort of neutral, and it's really kind of what goes into it to then lead to those outcomes. But I think that, part of the interesting thing with sport is that it sometimes doesn't get onto the agenda. If you're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, sport is kind of embedded within, and whether that's in terms of addressing issues of equality and inclusion, like SDG 10 or SDG, for gender equity, that oftentimes you can look at where sport can fit into the SDGs. And we've seen, different reports being done and different organizations that, try to articulate the case for why sport, should be more at the forefront. But I think that's sort of one of the challenges, is to show that sports is not just entertainment, it's not just escape, or, it's not something that we don't really, need and utilize as sort of part of the development, part of human rights, part of, how we see and value our lives. And so, I think we're making small steps toward that, but I still think that sort of the, initial thought with sport is, oh, this is our entertainment, or this is our escape, rather than this is sport and this is what we're going to do with it to change the world for better. And I think that in many ways the two can go together. But I think part of it is, how do we make it work so that it can go together? And I think that's part of why I've, stick with it, because I think it is, sometimes it seems kind of easy to do, but in some ways it becomes more challenging than just because I think we get stuck with kind of the, what sport is maybe assumed to be versus rather than what it can be or what it should be. So yeah, maybe that's just the start of the answer. I'm happy to talk further.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's and I just want to just chime in here for one moment. The one really great way I've seen, one organization that I've seen do great work is Kids Play International. I'm an athlete ambassador for them, and they use sport to promote gender equity, and our program in Rwanda it's made like such an impact on kids there, from boys thinking like, okay, girls, like, you need to stay home and clean and cook, to, okay, actually, what, like, we get on the playing field and we're all the same. And it's it's taken some time, but it can have such an impact in the lives of people. So
And there's so many, and there's just, it's amazing to see the growth and the issues and topics they're tackling, and the commitment. But yeah, that's, so many. It's, now I'm sort of oftentimes evaluating and, reviewing a lot of them and their models. And so it's really amazing to see kind of the range of organizations and programs and projects.
and I'm always excited to see Olympic athletes doing something like that after they retire from sport.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think this is actually a good transition into, you mentioned sort of, issues of sort of bridging issues of race and sex and national origin and religion. And, one of the fundamental principles in the charter, so Principle 6, states that the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in this Olympic Charter shall be secured without discrimination of any kind, such as race, color, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And that the scope of this is much broader than it used to be. But what changes do you think still need to be made?
Yeah, no, I mean, in 2014 was when I think sexual orientation was added, and that was a big effort and a lot of work. And then now, and we can talk more about sort of the human rights side of things. And, the International Olympic Committee is, continuing to advance and grow their human rights strategy. And in some ways, the Principle 6 non-discrimination does sort of fall within that. And so they are sort of, even from conversations over the last year or so, they are reviewing and looking at what they can do to, update it even further. But one of the areas that's missing is disability. Disability is missing from the Principle 6. And so during Tokyo, we organized more than 100 organizations specifically on, we'll talk about the Rule 50 project, which is one thing. And then after we worked on Rule 50, we also, within the disability community, wanted to raise awareness about Principle 6. But then, there are other, even in Principle 6, like age, for example, age is not in Principle 6. So, I mean, that could be an interesting one as well. But disability, I think, is an interesting one just because, there are, Olympians with disabilities that have competed in different sports, a handful over the years. Also administrators, coaches, referee, there are also volunteers, media. I mean, there's all sorts of stakeholders with persons with disabilities that are within the Olympic system, in addition to the fact that the Olympics has this Paralympic partnership, and also Special Olympics and Deaf Olympics and some of these other relationships as well. So, it seems like it would be a good thing to articulate disability as part of what is happening, in addition to the IOC's connection to the UN and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So, I think there's some factors there that would illuminate where disability would make sense. So hopefully, we'll see that with kind of the emerging human rights strategy overall, which includes some of these other topics I think we'll address. But that is one of them. I know the last we've heard is that, they're reviewing all of, and including Principle 6. So, and that may be later this year. That could be in the next year or two. I'm not sure the exact timeline.
Well, sometimes it takes quite a lot of effort to make the IOC change. And you mentioned Sochi in 2014, and that was when all of these changes were made. The list was much shorter before, and that was as a result of Russia passing a statute that basically discriminated against same-sex couples. So and there was a lot of public outcry, worldwide, from organizations and athletes and others. So it took a lot of, I think, in that case, a lot of external pressure from external stakeholders to force some change. I think positive change, but I absolutely agree with you.
We got to learn. I mean, part of the learnings was from, the athlete allies and the Hudson, Ian and, all these folks that worked on some of these other, even on gender equity. And so just part of it's been learning and connecting the dots to bring disability into the fold a little bit.
That seems like a logical next step to add that for sure. Okay, so let's see. Let me take a look at the questions. Okay, we've got well, let's address a couple of questions that and then we'll kind of get back to the flow of the ones we've been
Sure.
discussing. But all right, so question from Stu Seltzer, a professor here at NYU in our program, the Tisch Institute. So Stu asks, can you share your thoughts on the Ukrainian war and the Olympic response? It seems the Olympic Committee really banned the Russians in the Paralympics this time. Not just this time.
I could just, yeah. I mean, it was an interesting time period because of everything that happened. And, it was also really interesting because I can just mention briefly, Sherry, my Sherry is very involved with the delegation that was, she was the head of delegation for the team in Beijing. And so it was just, being able to talk back and forth with her. And also just to see even just the news and so forth, to see the change of what happened, because at first they did not, ban, and then they overnight, basically what happened was there was a reaction. And I think that what happened was that they were following the rules initially and following what's in their guidebooks. But then I don't think they anticipated that some of the major countries were actually going to potentially pull their athletes out of the games. And so that's actually what sort of tipped the conversation to some extent. So I think it was a little bit, they were following, protocol to some extent. And also, looking at where they were at the time with what happened during the Olympic Games, and there was the period of 2-week period, and then the Paralympics. So things even changed, day to day. So it was very kind of a moment to moment, if you will. But I think that, I think glad that where they got to the decision, I think some would have said, oh, they should have made it initially. I was talking to some of my colleagues, and we were like, well, and then some of my colleagues that do governance, they said, well, actually, from a governance perspective, they kind of followed the governance at the time. And then as soon as the countries were going to pull out, and that sort of changed the game a bit. So, I'm again, like I mentioned to Cameron, I don't, if I'm going to tell you if I don't know the whole answer, and I don't know every detail because I wasn't in the room, but just from what I've heard and what I've seen in some of the exchanges back and forth, that at least they got to the place they got before, and then the Ukrainian athletes were able to, compete and walk into the opening ceremony. But I think we're all learning and experiencing in real time. And I think that was pretty fascinating, I think, for everybody to see that.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And this will continue to evolve, I think. So and some like Rule 50 related conduct from Russian gymnasts with wearing the Z on their shirt. But we'll get to Rule 50 and actually why don't we slide right into to Rule 50.
Sure.
So let's see. So if you've taken sports law with me or Olympic sport governance, you probably know what Rule 50 is. But if not, we'll just so we're all on the same page here. Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter states that no kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. And then the International Paralympic Committee has a similar rule. So Section 2.2 says that no kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Paralympic venues or other areas related to the Paralympic Games. And Eli, I know that, and we'll talk some more in a little bit about the Athletes and Social Change Forum that you're involved with at the Muhammad Ali Center. But after last year's forum, a group of people wrote an open letter to the IOC and the IPC asking for those organizations to amend the rules. So to change Rule 50 and IPC Section 2.2, and the letter asked to demonstrate a commitment to human rights, racial justice, and social inclusion in the Olympic and Paralympic movements. So what changes do you think need to be made to those rules? Like, what are some of the issues around this Rule 50?
Yeah, and I can just quickly just talk about how we got to the letter, just in terms of like why we decided,
Yeah,
to
great.
organize a letter from experts around the world. One of the reasons why is because the IOC in particular said they had consulted with human rights and sport experts, and so part of our rationale is our recognition that really they had not, consulted with human rights and sport experts. We wanted to demonstrate, and at the forum, at the Ali Center Forum, we had just had a 2-day session around collective action and athlete activism. That was sort of the theme, and so coming off of that, it really seemed we've kept, over the years we picked different topics and themes. They kind of all are related to athlete activism and athletes and social change on different areas. But then as far as, the letter, and a colleague of mine, Yannick Kluch, who's at Virginia Commonwealth, really led the drafting, and him and I, did a lot of the mobilization and coordination. And, we wished we had more time to, reach out to more and more scholars and friends. And, we probably could have had 1,000 people, if we had more time. But we just used, it was actually within a week period, we just sort of did a reach out, and I think we had about 40 or 50 athletes, and then about 100 or so scholars and experts, and yeah, and part of it was just to make the case for how the Rule 50 and Section 2.2 should be more centered around freedom of expression, should be more centered, if there is going to be a case for addressing hate speech, then that needs to be, better articulated. But it was really about, if you're going to have this UN connection, that's, really needs to abide by, the UN principles. And if you look at Article 19, which is around freedom of expression, then that needs to really be upheld. I mean, even in the context of sport, even in the context, and also to recognize that sometimes these clauses around, neutrality is oftentimes, it's not authentic in a way of really what's happening. And I'm happy to talk about like examples we're seeing in professional sports and other things that are happening where we, coming off of, everything that's happening in the United States, and the way the world changed in the last couple of years. But there's ways that it can be done, but it's about being progressive and recognizing the value of human rights and social justice. So I'll stop there and we can keep talking.
Great, thank you. Let's see. So I had a couple more sort of related questions, and I'm curious, what kind of demonstrations do you think should be allowed at the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and where should those be able to happen?
I mean, I feel strongly that it should be, especially if it's a demonstration for, social justice, or along the lines of what we've seen with, the NBA, or even the new rules from the Commonwealth Games. But I would say, I mean, I've really been impressed by the NBA and the WNBA in terms of what they're allowing in terms of expression of racial, social justice, also, gender equity, other issues that are about equity and inclusion, that are not taking a stance of harming anyone, that are not taking a stance of hate speech in any way, but are just about showing a commitment to a position diversity and inclusion, of equity across the board. To me, those I feel those could and should happen on the anywhere, you know. Um, and so I think that it's important that athletes, have freedoms that are recognized even in organized sport. And so I think that the humanity of we talk about um, the values, and we see Olympism and everything. And so in some ways it's a little bit hypocritical to not allow the athletes to really express themselves, in a way that is upholding these same values. So yeah, I think that's sort of where I'm on the continuum. Um, there may, obviously situation by situation, and maybe there's uh, ways to evaluate them or give, a protocol in place that can allow a quick decision to then, verify or allow. But from a human rights standpoint, from a Article 19 standpoint, I believe an athlete should really be protected in those ways.
And I'm curious what your thoughts are on like making some kind of, political speech or, gesture or demonstration of some sort on the medal podium or on the playing field.
Yeah.
Because I know there's been discussion around, if you are so lucky as to like make it onto the medal podium, maybe you don't want to be standing next to someone who is making a protest of some sort and, sort of intruding on your moment of victory. What
Yeah,
are your
no,
thoughts?
I think that if it's an expression of, racial or gender equity or disability inclusion, if you're at the Paralympics or the Olympics and you want to promote disability inclusion and put wear a band or a pin or a shirt. I mean, to me, I feel like that should be, especially with what the Olympics and Paralympics are all about. If they're about inclusion and about diversity, it seems like an athlete should be able to, or if they want to wear a rainbow band, and some of these things were allowed. There's example, we just did a, SIR Law, the sport law conference. We just kind of went through a bunch of examples where some of these things were given approval, and that's why I think, it's, I think we have to be consistent. You can't not preclude racial justice, but, allow, gender statements or statements around sexual orientation or disability. I mean, we have to support racial justice as well. Otherwise, it's, seems pretty discriminatory to just preclude that. So that's why some of the language in there that kind of is calling out racial justice as something that's precluded, that seems to me to be a little bit targeted and also historical, because why was it added, and so, but now how we've progressed as a society. So I think what we'll see hopefully is in the new updated human rights strategy that may come out either this year or maybe next year, that we'll see some progress. I mean, it may not be perfect. I mean, I'm sure, still debate and, but I think we'll see some progress along these lines, because there's been a lot of consultations, a lot of groups, a lot of people, a lot of more experts are coming into the fold. But yeah, I think it's gonna be really interesting next couple of years for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you kind of led into the next question. I think you answered this in part, but my question was, because Rule 50 addresses, religious and racial propaganda. Well, first of all, like, what's propaganda, and why only like religious and racial propaganda? Why are only those prohibited and not what if it's sexist or like some, I don't know, whatever other kind of comment you want to make? Why only those two? And I think you answered that.
I believe it's historical. I believe the reason why it was initially added in the, I mean, like this 70s or 80s, I mean, it was, these are all historical, and then updated a little bit, but then it still hasn't progressed to some of the language just really needs to be completely changed. But I think it does. I mean, Rule 50 is necessary in some ways for protection against hate speech and but in terms of protection, so I think part of it is getting a really good group of experts, and experts that really are progressive and thinking, in a way of what can be done, and also using some of these best practices. So we've now seen what can be done, and so I think the times have changed a bit, and so hopefully it's the Olympics and Paralympics kind of move in that direction.
Yep. Great. All right. I have a few more questions, but we've got a number of questions from the audience. So let's maybe turn to some of those. So, all right. So a question from another one of my students, Yuki. Thanks for coming. Yuki asks, how do you think the Olympics and Paralympics can help niche or unpopular sports develop?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Olympics and the Paralympics, they are, a platform, and they do bring attention and visibility, but they aren't the be all end all. I mean, there are other ways of growing sports, of engaging, of being a part of, national, international federations, and building sports up. I mean, even seeing how sports like skateboarding and surfing and rock climbing, like some of those sports that kind of have come onto the program. Um, I think that's been really interesting. I mean, in many ways, it kind of goes back to people. So, people that and small groups of people that come together to organize and mobilize around different sports is really important. Uh, but I do think that also it's important that, there are ways for those sports that may not be, as visible, or aren't getting the same type of visibility to have mechanisms to be supported. And so I think that's kind of has been a challenge in a lot of ways. And I think that's where, more work needs to be done for sure. But I think that the Olympics and Paralympics, it would be interesting to see if there could be a way for their, again, it kind of goes back to intentionality, if the Olympics and Paralympics could actually have a more intentional strategies to help to bring more attention to different sports. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think for those of us that kind of believe in the power of sport and all sports and different ways of doing sports, I think that there's so many different ways of, and I think we'd love to see more attention, to all these different types of sports, and not just only, thinking about how do we build that out. Good question. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm gonna circle back around to, or you are, I'll just ask the question to the current theme for this year's International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, which is focused on climate change. So Wanda Wakefield, hey Wanda, a friend from the luge world, asks, what role do you think athletes have in addressing climate change? What's their interest and involvement in making change in this area?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And this is kind of a newer emerging area. And so I think it's essential, it's important. It's very important that the sports world, international federations, athletes, and especially what we, have seen not only in sport, but in the, governments and international organizations trying to really focus on climate change and the environment and how important it is. But yeah, I think that it's amazing that for this year, that the theme for this year is going to be around this topic. There's an interesting group called the Sport Ecology Sport Ecology Lab, and I would suggest everyone, check them out, because it is a group of sport management, scholars and researchers that are coming together around sport. But there also you're starting to see more and more groups of athletes. So kind of going back to the athlete question, it's really, Karen may even know more about it too, but I'm definitely seeing more and more athlete groups that are focusing on the environment in different sorts of ways. But I think that across many issues, we're seeing the power of the athlete voice. And so the more that athletes bring attention to their national, international federations, and it has the potential to actually get on the table and actually be important. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think that that's why hopefully this, not only this April 6th, but just ongoing, that there's really even more efforts that bring attention, because we're seeing it in real time, what's happening to our environments, to our, communities, both after games enter, and trying to be more, friendly to, you know, and also in terms of like what metrics are being used, what criteria are being used to evaluate. Um, and so I think that's, there is one of the colleagues that works on the ecology lab is out of Texas A&M. Texas A&M. He runs the Brian McCullough. He's part of what helped to draft the UN climate change in sport charter. Um, and so that it seems like there's more and more initiatives coming forward. And so that's part of it also for me, is just to learn, that's, and like I said, it's not an area that I've focused a lot on. Um, but it's definitely one that seems to be emerging quite a bit, especially the last few years.
And Wanda, I just shared a link in the chat to an article about what some athletes are doing to sort of promote or to address climate change, and it particularly for winter athletes, this has had a huge impact on places that can host the winter games and other and winter sports. So. All right, so we've got 8 minutes left and a couple of questions. So hopefully we can get through these. So David Fuller asks, what role can or should corporate brands play in this space? And are there any brands that are doing this well authentically?
Yeah, no, that's a good, in terms of the role of corporate social responsibility, in terms of the role that corporations play to support, athlete activists or athletes that are promoting, human rights, or even just to, get involved. I mean, I guess I would say there's really two parts of the question. One is sort of at a, systems level, in terms of at the Olympic or Paralympic level, what is the responsibility of those sponsors to actually, call attention or bring these forward. And I think that's one area that I think we're starting to see more and more of, kind of what is the obligation of the top sponsors, of the sponsors to uphold, human rights in terms of, city, Olympic game selection processes for country selection, in terms of, the sponsoring of the games, in terms of overall, efforts and investments. And then there's a second level, which is, corporations that are getting behind athletes. And that could be a range of issues. That could be on some of the topics we've discussed. It could be on the mental health. It can be on specific issues of gender equality, on all these issues that we've talked about. And I would say we're seeing a little bit of that happening. We're seeing some athletes, that are being supported, that they may speak up or speak out on a topic, and then their sponsors will stick with them. I can't say that there's really any that have like completely blown it out of the water per se, but there are some that they're showing a commitment to social responsibility, and showing kind of what they're investing in, and that could be anything from an apparel sponsor, so that I would say sometimes you see Nike doing really good things. Sometimes you see Under Armour, Reebok. You see them doing different things at different times. And I think part of it is, could there be more of a consistency to it? And also sometimes you see like, you take 3 steps forward and 1 step back. And so that's on the apparel side. As far as other sponsors, Yeah, it's actually interesting because we, you know, there's been some different like awards programs, um, and at the professional sport level. So you have like a team of the year, league of the year, corporate sponsor of the year. And so yeah, sometimes you see interesting innovations or projects or collaborations. On the league level, it's been interesting to look at professional sports because you see like the NBA and WNBA really being a standard of best practice, um, and then to see where others are going. Um, but then on the corporate side, it's kind of a mixed bag of different best practices. Uh, but yeah, you can look up some of like the different like Beyond Sport or some of those other awards, the ESPN citizenship. You can kind of look at what people are doing.
So maybe the Power of Sport Lab can work on like a set of best practices for the commercial partners, like sponsors and broadcast partners. Your next project, because you don't have enough already.
Exactly. No,
All
that's a
right.
good point, yeah.
Yeah. So we've just got a couple of minutes left, and I have a question that I wanted to end with, and yeah, I think this probably will be our last one. But Eli, this has been a really like such a pleasure to have you here today and to hear about what you're doing and all of this really positive change that we can all make through sport. So if someone in the audience today, let's say, wanted to sort of join this movement of using sport for the greater good, what tips would you have for them? Like how can they go about getting involved?
That's a good question. I think there's definitely some resources and some websites and articles and kind of learning about the history. I know I see the whole John Carlos and Tommy Smith, and some of the historical stories as well as some of the current ones. The Gwen Berries and Race and Bowden. I think there's some really great humans, some examples of athletes that are really just doing a lot at the athlete level. But then there's organizations. There's like sportanddev.org is a resource that you can learn a lot about different sport for development and social change organizations. There's also the Beyond Sport is an interesting group. They have some good materials, some resources. Um, but also just some of the just looking up sport for development, sport and social change, doing some of your own googling. But I think part of it is to find the questions that you're really passionate about, and what are the problems that you like to explore. One of the things that I found about this space is that people tend to be pretty open and wanting to share and get people involved. So I mean, I know that I oftentimes get contacted, a couple times a week, and I try my best to share some things and help to get people in the loop. I know that that's really the case for many colleagues around the world. So, if you do have an interest and passion around the power of sport, sport for social change, athlete activism area, then there's definitely, great people, great resources, support. So yeah, feel free to reach out anytime and happy to chat. Anybody that would like to follow up.
All right, great. Eli, thank you so much. I think we are closing in on 6 o'clock, and I promised to end on time. So thank you everyone for attending today. I hope you enjoyed it. And Eli, if you're open to me sharing your contact info, folks can follow up with Eli or me or anyone else you might want you have questions for. So thanks again for coming, and hopefully see you at the next Chalk Talk.
Yeah.